we had a different service planned earlier this week. I had a different sermon written earlier this week, one that fit the joy of the last Sunday of the Easter season, one that stuck to the lectionary and the prayers that were written months ago. But then this week happened, and we decided we couldn't white knuckle our way through anymore. That church should be the last place where we pretend that everything is fine. Even though I'm worried that talking about this week will open floodgates that will be impossible to close, and we'll just cry forever. Because how could we not cry after this week? But what can I say about this week? It is too much. This week that we set aside to remember all those in the armed forces who have lost their lives defending our country. This week that marked the second anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. This week just after the 1 millionth person died of COVID. This week where the news cycle has already moved on from 2 different racist attacks because of the atrocity of a mass shooting at a school. This week that was already too full of other more everyday sorrows and deaths and fears and anxiety. So what can I say about this week? Maybe I can say, Lord have mercy. Maybe I should say something has to be done. Most of all, what I want to say is, God, where are you? What have you been doing? Why is this happening? When will it stop? This text from John, our gospel, was already assigned in the lectionary, and I kept it because I think it speaks to this week in 2 ways. This prayer is from Jesus' final discourse as he prepares the disciples for his death and later ascension. Just after Jesus finishes praying this prayer, while the disciples listen, they all go to the garden and pray, and Jesus is handed over to the authorities. Jesus knows that physically he will no longer be with these faithful people. He knows the trials they will face and the sorrows that they will endure. And the thing he wants them to know, this important thing that he left for the end, is that he will never truly leave him. Jesus prays, "As you, Father, are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me." He says, "I made your name known to them, and I will make it known, so that the love with which you have loved me may be in them, and I in them." Even though Jesus may not physically be with the disciples, he wants to make sure, even as they watch him be beaten, as they stand at the foot of the cross, as they see their Lord and teacher take their last breath, he wants them to know that he has not abandoned them, that he will never abandon them. Jesus is united with his people, the way that his Father and the Holy Spirit is united with him. And this can be hard to believe, especially in a week like this one. So then we also have the promises of Psalm 46 to remind us that God's people have always been united with God, that God has never left us in times of trouble. in fires, in floods, in wars, in the world shaking, God has been present. Martin Luther took this psalm and turned it into the song, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." And I love that song. I can see this psalm as a hymn of triumph. But this week, I like it even more as a still, small song of protest, where the most important word is though. Though the earth should change, though the mountains shake in the heart of the sea, though its waters rage and foam, though the mountains tremble with its tumult, even while terrible things are happening, we trust that God is present, that God is one with us enough, that God mourns with us, that God does not stop bad things from happening. But in the midst, though they are happening, God is still there. And so we will not be afraid. Though God might not be a mighty fortress that prevents death, God promises that God has been in every foxhole. Though God's love has not kept illness at bay, God was at every ICU bedside. Though God's justice has not yet dismantled white supremacy or systemic sin, God is kneeling on the city streets with everyone who can't breathe. Though there are more guns than people in this country, though we feel helpless and despairing that this could ever change, God is present in every classroom, at every shooting, at every funeral, every candlelight vigil. And most importantly, though this is the world we live in now, God is not content that this is the world we stay in. God watched his only son be killed. And God's grief shook the very foundations of the earth. God's grief today is still shaking foundations. Can you feel it? When it feels unsteady, like everything is in chaos. That is God crying out in rage and sorrow and pain. This is not how things are supposed to be. This is God crying out in promise yet again that we are united, that our grief is God's grief, that our pain is God's pain. That even though there are death dealing forces at work, God is with us and has not given up. God's cry that shakes the whole earth is a cry to us, so that God's resolve would be our resolve, and God's desires would be our desires. That though we live in a world full of violence and warfare and death, God is already working. Our psalm says, God makes wars cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the shields with fire. God changed the world with the resurrection of Jesus. Though it seemed like death had won, God was still working for God's people. And God is working now. I want to leave you with a blessing from Jan Richardson. a blessing in a time of violence, which is to say, this blessing is always, which is to say, there is no place this blessing does not long to cry out in lament, to weep its words in sorrow, to scream its lines in sacred rage, which is to say, there is no day this blessing ceases to whisper into the ear of the dying, the despairing, the terrified. Which is to say, there is no moment this blessing refuses to sing itself into the heart of the hated and the hateful, the victim and the victimizer, with every last ounce of hope it has. Which is to say, there is none that can stop it, none that can halt its course, none that will still its cadence, none that will delay its rising, none that can keep it from springing forth from the mouths of us who hope, from the hands of us who act, from the hearts of us who love, from the feet of us who will not cease our stubborn, aching, marching, until this blessing has spoken its final word, until this blessing has breathed its benediction in every place, in every tongue. Peace, peace, peace. Today, we mourn and grieve and weep and know that God cries with us. Tomorrow, we shake the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold.